AI. Narrative divergence is not just common, it is exactly what exists. The concept that there is one narrative makes no sense. And the reason for that is that narratives are not made up of facts. Narratives are things put together. And how they are put together is not necessarily forward in time, but retroactively. And this is a very common thing about humans. It's everywhere all the time. And not only will it not change, but it gets worse. Now, my history is, well, my history is a place where identities have lived vastly longer periods than what people now see in the US. And you might wonder what I'm talking about. Well, there was an event that happened recently in the US. It's now the third time in the same city. And I'm not going to talk about that in detail. I'm going to talk about how narratives diverge. So, one example of a narrative divergence is what we see with very old identities, each one telling its inhabitants that long before they were born and long after they die, there is a reality via which they live their life. And again, people want to think that there is a right or wrong, and this is where the clash comes. If one has the luxury, as we do, with a scientific mindset and education and living outside of those hot zones. Hello, good to hear you. Yes, and to hear you was good, Cosmic Rose. The narratives are considered by the people who are inhabited by those narratives to be true. Now, if you believe a narrative to be true, which is absolutely your right, and you could be right, you might not be, it's not my point. A consequence of believing that your narrative is correct means that the narrative, an alternative narrative, must be incorrect. This is the first step where we as humans begin our clash. Because what's the consequence of hearing another narrative, an alternate narrative, which you say must be incorrect? Well, if it's incorrect, then the other person has to be stupid, mistaken, or lying. Now, if the person is stupid, mistaken, or lying, then you've already concluded within your narrative that as a consequence of your narrative, part of humanity must be stupid, mistaken, or lying. Now, the interesting fact is, of course, that when you jump into the narrative of the other person, or who is inhabited by the alternate narrative, their consequence is that you must be stupid, mistaken, or lying. How does that resolve? Well, it resolves in conflict and, in very rare cases, evidence. Evidence, narrative, scientific analysis is something that is extremely rare. G'day, Phoenix. It's so rare that we have to teach it at university. Because if it was so natural to us as humans, why would we be needing to teach it? Someone might have an answer to that. I look forward to hearing it. But it is in no way reasonable to suspect that people are purely logical and rational actors. And one of the ways that we can see that about ourselves is looking at what makes up a narrative. It's not a coincidence that people of a certain political ideology, location, familial structure have a similar point of view, and that an alternate side has another point of view. You don't see crisscrossing. You don't see 90% of the audience of one news media in America all of a sudden become members of the alternate media. This doesn't happen. What you have, they forget their own bias. We do as humans. I think part of that is our ego. Our ego, and I don't mean that in an arrogant sense. I mean our sense of self, our sense of identity doesn't allow us to factor in that perhaps we are absolutely and completely wrong. And when I say wrong, I don't mean that our story is wrong. I mean that to think that there is a story is also wrong. So, for example, is it possible that someone could be innocent and be shot by someone who thinks they're guilty? And the answer is yes. But what's actually happened in that case? The answer is that someone's been shot. Everything else is filled in by us as humans. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong at all. What I'm saying is they're filled in. So how do we figure out what's actually true? Is the person innocent or are they not, Boss Briggs? But there's another question. Is the person shot believed to be innocent by the person doing the shooting? And again, we have an increase in narrative complexity. Because on top of that, if the other person who does the shooting believes that the person who got shot was a threat, do the rest of the people believe that the person doing the shooting believed that the person was a threat? So now we have a double belief problem. So we have person A who does the shooting, person B who gets shot, person C who believes that person A knew that they were killing an innocent person. But we have person D who believes that the person doing the shooting, person A, believed that person B was a threat. So now you have a problem between person C and person D. So all of a sudden we've turned someone getting shot into a conflict between C and D who had nothing to do with the shooting. And this is a very typical human narrative. It's happened all the time, everywhere. I see it all the time on Middle Eastern news media, which unfortunately I get exposed to and have been exposed to for too many decades. It's their fault, they're wrong. No, it's their fault, they're wrong. And this is quite a common and in fact natural position for humans to hold. So the tribalism that you see in the Middle East is not unusual. To me, it's a consequence of identities having lived long enough for those conflicts to become so embedded. Now, is the same thing happening around the world in other parts of the places where people thought they weren't as tribal? Well, the answer is yes. And the reason, I think, is because humans are tribal. Without education, without knowledge, without understanding of our own human psychology, we end up in exactly this location. We believe that our story is correct, that it's factual, and that the other person must be bad, a liar, an idiot, or mistaken. And I've said this so many times, which is why I'm saying this seemingly so fluently without any reading anything, because we said this many, many times 10 years ago on Periscope. And back then I was young enough to think that things would be different. Now I'm thinking to myself how arrogant I was as a young person, thinking that we talking about this would change anything, considering it's been like this for 100,000 years. Who are we who've been living for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 60 years, can change 100,000 years of human psychology, the result of millions of years of evolution? Potentially, laws and evidence are important. Now, I don't want to talk about the current shooting and the issue with ICE. The reason is because people will immediately be triggered and fall into one side or the other. So I thought to myself, I'll talk about something that happened a little while ago. And I think it was France Airlines or France Airways, I'm not sure. But 289 people on board died. And that is the fact of the story. 289 people died. Okay. But then, of course, we as humans start adding everything else. People affiliated with the airline said it was a technical error. People not affiliated with the airline said that the pilots were not good pilots. And this was the argument that kept happening for 2 years until they found the black box, which gave the evidence, which actually ended up telling us what the truth was. If you want to know the truth, feel free to look it up. Just with what I gave you, I'm sure you'll find it very quickly, given AI's ability to search these days. So what is the point? The point is that in this particular case, we had 2 years of humans coming up with stories, right? And that they genuinely believed to be correct. This was true. This had to be true. This had to be true. This is exactly what happened. We have this footage. We have that footage. I had calls from people who died, etc., etc. Right? I'm just adding those things. I don't know if that's actually true. That's me myself adding to the narrative. And it was until evidence. But we as humans have to come up with conclusions prior to evidence determining what the situation is. This is unbelievably ubiquitous. It is what humans do. And without deferring to evidence as the ultimate metric, we continue to do this and will continue to do this until our species is replaced. Anyway, that's the end of it. So will this change anything? No. Will we find out in 2 or 3 years what's actually occurred with the video analyses? Will Fox News and MSNBC converge on a narrative? No. Does that benefit the dividing of the US? Sure. Will that continue? Yes. Will other countries benefit? Absolutely. Who said we have to? Well, I would love to know that. I would love to be wrong. I mean, it would be amazing to be wrong, and I wake up tomorrow and the whole world rallies around the evidence and comes up with a narrative that shows how people with a gun can be extremely convinced that they're in the right, and someone with a mobile phone can be extremely convinced that they're in the right. And all of a sudden, we all hold hands and say, "Yes, we realize that we as humans are flawed, and we have to get around this." I would love that. We'll see if it happens. In the meantime, it's always a pleasure. And until next time, don't forget to take life one smack at a time. One smack. So I had a coffee, but my hair was in its Semitic afro stage of the morning, and I couldn't be bothered brushing it. I'm going to go brush it now, but it's Sunday morning and I'm tired. All right. Ciao. Lovely to see you as always.